Hello and welcome to this video on beliefs in society, religion, religiosity and globalization. Religion has long existed in a worldwide context and for centuries it has spread across the globe. Today the world is more interconnected and interdependent than ever before as a result of the globalization process. Because of this, religion has often been described as the original globalizer. Anthony Giddens looks specifically at religious fundamentalism in this global context and argues that religious fundamentalism is a reaction to globalization. He states that fundamentalism provides rigid certainty in an uncertain late modern world. Fundamentalism refers to the process of returning to the basics of a religion, that is, the sacred texts, and belief in the absolute truth of those sacred texts. Fundamentalists themselves are traditionalists, Giddens argues. They believe unquestioningly in the literal and infallible truth of Scripture. It cannot be proven wrong. The one true view of the world is the view that they hold, that is, the view their religion holds. It's a single meta-narrative that explains everything. These individuals tend to be dogmatic rather than pragmatic, sticking to their ideology and beliefs rather than taking on new ideas as new evidence is provided to them. They place their faith before individual reason or rationality, and therefore they tend to avoid those outside the faith as that might lead to awkward questions or cause them to question their faith. What tends to happen is those who engage in religious fundamentalism rely on guardians or clerics to interpret the sacred text for them. So they're not actually themselves reading the sacred text, they're relying on someone in a position of power or authority to tell them what the sacred texts say and how they should live their lives. In terms of the features of religious fundamentalism, well, there is a belief in the exact working and wording of the sacred texts, and they will often cite quotations to justify their actions. Those who engage in religious fundamentalism had a world-rejecting attitude to wider society and often isolate themselves from the mainstream and others within society who might have different views. There's often an attempt to shock the population through extreme views or acts of terrorism to gain public attention and to gain further support. We see this in the example of the Westboro Baptist Church in the United States of America. Religious fundamentalists often use modern technology to promote their message and recruit followers. In particular, the internet is a key tool in this regard, and this could be seen as rather ironic as they often tend to resist most other forms of social change and modernity. Many are awaiting the end of days due to a form of divine intervention. That is, they believe that any moment now, perhaps God or Jesus or some sort of prophet is about to return who's going to remake the world order, and they will be rewarded for their devotion to the religion. We tend to find religious fundamentalism to be patriarchal in nature and inspired by rather conservative and traditional values. Returning to Giddens, Giddens argues that in late modern life and late modern society there is so much uncertainty, whether it be with regards to sexuality, gender, family diversity, economic uncertainty, or even political instability. Therefore, people might turn to religious fundamentalism because it provides, again, that idea of rigid structure or crutch to lean on in times of difficulty. It's a way of retreating to faith-based answers in a globalised world which demands more pragmatic rationality. Giddens decides to contrast fundamentalism with cosmopolitanism, which is a way of thinking which embraces modernity and globalization. In many ways, Giddens almost suggesting here this is how one might combat fundamentalism if one indeed sees it as a threat to society. Cosmopolitanism is an ancient idea going all the way back to ancient Greece, where famously Diogenes came up with the concept of cosmopolitanism, claiming that he wasn't a citizen of Athens or any particular city-state, but rather he was a citizen of the world. He was a cosmopolite, someone who embraced that which is new, that which is different, and celebrated it, wanted to be part of every society and no society at the same time. Cosmopolis was Diogenes' ideas that one day perhaps there might be a global society, so you wouldn't have people feeling divided based on what part of the world they came from or indeed what religion they believe in. Rather, they would see themselves as part of some sort of global body or even global religion. So this would be a global society based on the liberal value of tolerance and mutual respect, saying that anyone can believe whatever they want to believe or do whatever they want to do, provided it doesn't harm anyone else or upset anyone else's rights. It requires reflexive thinking. It requires reason and rationality to be able to engage in cosmopolis and to be a cosmopolite. You need to be open-minded and, again, tolerant. And it's all about the pursuit of personal meaning and self-improvement before the submission to an external authority, whether that be a religious leader or even a state leader. Yet fundamentalism is very much clearly in diametric opposition to this. They tend to pick and choose which parts of modernity they like and which parts they choose to reject. So in many ways we can see within cosmopolitanism a kind of criticism of how religious fundamentalism operates and religious fundamentalists think. However, we can of course criticise Giddens. It could be said that there's too sharp a distinction he's providing here. That is, not everyone is either a fundamentalist or a cosmopolitan. Generally, actually, most people are neither. There's something in the middle, and they often may not have any awareness or knowledge of what these two different ideas are in the first place. Next, Giddens also lumps all fundamentalisms together, which is somewhat problematic because fundamentalisms tend to be rather different, especially if we compare something like, who knows, Christianity to Hindu fundamentalism. It looks very different, so it requires a more sensitive approach. It could also be argued that perhaps religious fundamentalism is not necessarily a response to late modernity, but post-modernity. So we always need to remember with Giddens, he very much kind of argues for late modernity rather than post-modernity, but there is a whole kind of body of thinkers out there who would say that late modernity is a nonsense and actually we're in post-modernity. As we know, post-modernity brings with it freedom of choice, but it also brings uncertainty and risk. Postmodernity has undermined old certainties and traditions. It's been the death of meta-narratives. Manuel Castells identifies two responses in this sense within postmodernity. That is resistant identity, which is a defensive reaction where individuals who feel threatened retreat into that fundamentalist community, kind of what Giddens was saying, or project identity, which is more positive reaction where people who engage in a more progressive mindset engage with new ideas and concepts and trying to maybe add parts of them to their life or work out what's good for them. So perhaps we can see elements of cosmopolitanism there. There are, of course, different types of fundamentalism, as hinted at earlier in that criticism of Giddens. And although Bruce agreed with Giddens that religious fundamentalism is mainly caused by individuals who feel under threat from the adoption of different beliefs as a result of globalization and modernity, he argues that certain religions are more likely to generate fundamentalist movements than others. He would argue that polytheistic religions, religions where there's multiple gods, are less likely to generate fundamentalist movements than monotheistic religions where there's a single god. And that's because often monotheistic religions present their God as being ultimately correct and right, having the monopoly of truth, being absolutely truth, and therefore the sacred text, which was inspired by that God, being absolutely infallible and perfect. Whereas in polytheistic religions, there's kind of more scope and room for interpretation, discussion, debate, and no one God takes precedence. So therefore less likely perhaps to see fundamentalism there. By suggesting monotheistic religions have more potential to generate fundamentalist sects, Bruce is referring to Christianity and Islam specifically. However, he attempts to differentiate the two because Western Christian fundamentalist groups tend to come about as a response to changes within their own society, a perception that things are perhaps becoming too liberal, too modern and too progressive. Whereas Third World fundamentalism, as we see in the Middle East or North Africa, which tends to be Islamic in nature, is often a response to external influences that are attempting to erode their way of life or secularize their society. On a completely different angle, we look at the relationship between religion and conflict. Samuel P. Huntington, very famously an American neoconservative, argued that we could understand the world as being split into a whole range of different civilizations, of which the West could be one, but others could include things like the Islamic civilization and the Sinic or Chinese civilization. Civilizations for Huntington are larger than a single nation. They are instead a group of nations with similar heritage, history, culture, and most importantly, religion. Huntington predicted that these civilizations in future would come into conflict with each other, and in particular he said this would happen as a result of the end of the Cold War. The Cold War had been a big ideological conflict between the West and the East for the most part, namely capitalism and of course communism, that with the end of that, with there now being a single ideology, capitalism, which is supposed to unite the world, he argued that what would happen now is that civilization fault lines would appear along religious lines, and these different civilizations would therefore come into conflict. Huntington claimed to support this that religion has been the centre of a number of global conflicts in recent years. So by this point, we're talking the last 30 years. And actually, a brief look online or in any kind of history book can show us that perhaps Huntington may in fact be correct. Religion creates cohesion within civilizations. It binds people together, but conflict between civilizations. Since the end of communism, politics and ideology have diminished in importance, and globalization has undermined the nation-state, leading to religion filling the identity void. Globalization increases interaction between civilizations, increasing the likelihood of old conflicts re-emerging. So he's very much delving into the past, even as far as medieval period, and saying that those conflicts which weren't necessarily solved, but which went to sleep, as it were, during the 20th century, are now back in full force. What Huntington is doing in doing this is reawakening the us and them that actually existed in the Cold War, where it was the us, the West, the capitalist world, versus the them, the communist, the kind of second world. Conflicts occur where civilizations border, Huntington argued. Huntington saw history as a conflict of progress versus barbarism, and he believed the West to be under threat as a result. He predicted that there would be conflicts in future between civilizations when new alliances would form. In particular, he thought the Islamic and the Chinese civilizations would form an alliance against the West, and therefore that the West, the only way it could survive, would be to reassert its Christianity. However, there's a lot of problems with these ideas. Firstly, arguably Huntington falls into what is known as Orientalism, which is a form of racism, where he stereotypes Eastern nations as exotic or barbaric or untrustworthy or inferior or indeed fanatical, people who we should consider to be others, different from ourselves, and again it's that them versus us kind of mentality. He also ignores important religious divisions within civilizations. So within the Islamic civilization there's the ongoing battle or conflict between Sunni and Shia. He also portrays Islam as an enemy, lumping all Muslims together as jihadists, when in doing so what he's really doing is legitimising crusading, saying that Christians should have the right to go and kind of blow up Middle Eastern, North African nations and kind of control and conquer them in a kind of colonial fashion. Furthermore, his hostility towards the West that he identifies from other parts of the world is not necessarily from fundamentalism, but probably from Western foreign policy mistakes in the last 20 years. A whole range of examples perhaps we can point at, or at the very least we can talk about Western powers supporting the modern state of Israel and some of their perhaps slightly dubious practices. A different approach, again from the work of Bruce, concerns the concept of cultural defence. Bruce sees one function of religion in today's world as cultural defence. This is where religion serves to unite a community against an external threat. In such situations, religion has special significance for its followers because it symbolises the group or society's collective identity. Defending the community against a threat often gives religion a prominent role, in particular in the realm of politics. Two examples of Bruce's ideas include in Poland and also in Iran. In Poland, from 1945 to 1989, it was under communist rule imposed by the USSR. During this time, the Catholic Church was in fact suppressed because the USSR engaged in state atheism. The Church, however, was popular and became a rallying point for opposition to the Soviet Union. It lent its active support to a group known as Solidarity, which was a free trade union movement in the 1980s, and ultimately both the Union and the Church worked together to aid and abet the fall of the communist regime in Poland. So we can see an example about how the Polish people kind of rallied together and saw kind of engaging in that religious practice as a form of cultural defence against what was known as Russification. In Iran, Western capitalist powers and oil companies had strong influence in Iran in the middle of the 20th century and was involved in an illegal overthrow of a democratic government in the 1950s with a view to installing a pro-Western regime. Islam then became the kind of focus of the resistance. It rallied again the kind of people against Westernization and liberalization and modernization, and ultimately led to the Islamic Revolution of 1979 and the introduction of Sharia law, which still reigns to this day. Religion can also play a role in global development. As we saw in secularization theory, modernization generally undermines religion. The importance of science and technology in economic development and the rational worldview on which they depend are seen as destroying belief in the supernatural. On the other hand, religion may contribute to the development, as Weber argued in the case of the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism. More recently, sociologists have examined what role religion may play in development in today's globalising world. Nanda looked at India and the impact globalisation was having there, and to what extent God still played a role in Indian society. Now, globalisation has created a huge, prosperous, educated, urban middle class in India, who work primarily in IT, pharmaceuticals, and biotechnology sectors, closely tied to the booming economy. The people whom secularization theory predicts would be the first to abandon religion are exactly these people. However, a vast majority of this social class continue to believe in the supernatural. There's also been a dramatic increase in religious tourism from this group, for example, visiting shrines and temples. In fact, it's become fashionable to be religious and to be seen to be religious. The middle classes are also attracted to once low-status village gods and goddesses worshipped by the poor because they are seen to be more responsive to people's needs rather than kind of the big gods like your Vishnus and your Shivas and your Brahmas and so on. Nanda rejects poverty and existential insecurity as a reason for this because these groups are not poor. She also rejects the idea that their religiosity is a defence reaction to westernisation, as Bruce would argue. Instead, she argues that the Indian middle class are optimistic about the opportunities they have and what globalisation is bringing to the nation. Modern holy men and telegurus are dispensing business-friendly versions of Hinduism that accept materialism and see that consumerism can be spiritually balanced by paying for extravagant rituals. So what the middle classes are doing is they're kind of turning to a new age, new wave of kind of holy people who say to them, it's okay to be rich, that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, just give us some money and we can balance it out spiritually by performing some rituals on your behalf. So the modern version of Hinduism legitimates the position of the middle classes. This has ultimately led to the rise in what is known as Hindu ultranationalism, Nanda argues, where 93% of Indians, more than any other country, agree with the statement that our people are not perfect, but our culture is superior to others. India's success in the global market is increasingly attributed to the superiority of Hindu values, a view constantly promoted by the media and politicians, along with the idea that Hinduism is the essence of Indian culture and identity. The worship of Hindu gods has become the same as worshipping the nation of India, and Hinduism has become a civil religion in the kind of functionalist sense, in the sense that Bella would have argued. Hinduism has also penetrated public life, so for example, Hindu sciences such as astrology are being used to predict natural disasters, and there are whole kind of government departments that do research into sacred texts and pieces of magic to see how they might perhaps support or help the state. The Ministry of Defence apparently is organising magical weaponry. Redding looked at capitalism in East Asia. There was, especially in the 90s and early noughties, a huge boom in these economies, so much so that certain states became known as tiger economies, such as South Korea, Singapore and Taiwan, which have industrialised and become significant players in the global economy. And of course, we can't not talk about China. China is a major global industrial power now and looks like it will become eventually the biggest economy in the world in about the next 25 years or so. The success of capitalism here suggests that religion has played a role similar to the one Calvinism played in the development of capitalism if we follow the Weberian argument. The spirit of capitalism therefore can be found amongst Chinese entrepreneurs in the tiger economies who are practicing Confucian or Neo-Confucian, or sometimes referred to as post-Confucian values, which encourage hard work, discipline and a commitment to education and self-improvement. In many ways, this is a reiteration of the Protestant work ethic, just without the Christianity. Finally, Pentecostalism is a rapidly growing version of Christianity that we find not only in places like China and Asia, but also in Latin America and Africa. Berger argues that Pentecostalism in Latin America acts as a functional equivalent again to the Protestant ethic of Calvinism. Latin American Pentecostals embrace a work ethic and lifestyle similar to the Calvinists, and in Chile and South Brazil there is now a growing and prosperous Pentecostal middle class leading capitalist development. Layman also argued that Pentecostalism is a successful global religion because it is able to incorporate local beliefs. It validates local traditional beliefs while at the same time claiming to give believers access to greater power, in particular the Holy Spirit, that we find in Christianity as part of the Trinity. Pentecostalism creates new local religious forms rather than simply replacing existing local religions. So in Africa, for example, we've seen the Africanization of Christianity rather than a total disappearance of indigenous religions. So it ends up becoming a bit of a pick and mix of indigenous faiths, indigenous languages, kind of more traditional European, Middle Eastern Christian ideas, and European languages too. That's it. Thank you very much.